You might want to look at that badge again. Marcus Reed's voice was calm, almost quiet, but something in the way he said it made Officer Daniel Whitmore hesitate for half a second before the arrogance returned to his face. Red and blue lights flashed across the shoulder of a Virginia highway, washing over Marcus's dark SUV, the steel guardrail, and the passing cars that hissed by at nearly 70 miles per hour. Whitmore stood beside him with a federal credential in one hand and suspicion written across his face. To him, Marcus was still just a black man who had somehow ended up behind the wheel of a vehicle Whitmore had already decided looked too expensive, too clean, too out of place. The badge in his hand should have changed everything. It didn't. I don't care what this says, Whitmore replied, turning the credential beneath the beam of his flashlight, as if staring harder might somehow prove it false. Marcus said nothing. He kept his hands visible and his posture still. Years of federal training had taught him that control was not weakness. Sometimes the most powerful thing a man could do was refuse to give someone else the reaction they were looking for. Whitmore didn't understand that. Not yet. He believed he was running the stop. He believed the flashing lights, the uniform, and the authority of the roadside gave him control over every second that followed. What he didn't know was that 11 minutes later, a phone call from Washington would make every officer standing on that highway stop talking. And the reason had almost nothing to do with Marcus demanding special treatment. Less than half an hour earlier, Marcus had been driving north after a closed federal meeting outside Richmond, one hand resting lightly on the wheel while evening settled over the interstate. The sky had turned the color of cold steel, and the first highway lights were beginning to glow. His secure phone sat inside the center console. A sealed folder rested in his briefcase behind the passenger seat. Nothing about the drive felt unusual until a patrol cruiser appeared in his rearview mirror and stayed there. 1 mile passed, then 2. Marcus noticed without reacting. He checked his speed. 58 in a 60-mile-per-hour zone. He stayed in his lane. The cruiser remained behind him. Then the lights came on. Marcus signaled immediately and pulled onto the shoulder. He lowered the window, switched on the interior light, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. Whitmore approached slowly. License and registration. No greeting. No explanation. Marcus handed them over. Whitmore looked at the license, then at Marcus, then back at the vehicle. This your car? Marcus met his eyes. Yes, officer. Whitmore glanced toward the back seat. Where are you headed? Home. From where? Marcus paused. It was the first moment when the stop began to feel different. Richmond. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. What were you doing there? The question had nothing to do with speed. Nothing to do with a lane change. Nothing Marcus had done on the road. Still, he answered evenly. Work. Whitmore leaned slightly closer to the open window. What kind of work? Marcus could hear the passing traffic behind the officer, could see the body camera clipped to his chest, could feel the quiet shift from routine questioning into something else. He had seen that shift before. Suspicion first. Justification later. Marcus looked at the camera, then back at Whitmore. Officer, what was the reason for the stop? For the first time, Whitmore smiled. It wasn't friendly. We'll get to that. And in that moment, Marcus understood something Whitmore had not yet realized. The officer thought he was investigating the man inside the SUV. But every question, every assumption, and every second of that roadside encounter was beginning to create a record of someone else entirely. Whitmore stayed beside the open window for another moment, letting the silence stretch longer than it needed to. Marcus could tell the officer was waiting for discomfort, for hesitation, for any small reaction he could turn into suspicion. Instead, Marcus kept his breathing steady and his hands where they could be seen. Step out of the vehicle, Whitmore said. Marcus looked at him carefully. Am I being detained? Whitmore's expression tightened. I said step out of the vehicle. Marcus opened the door slowly and stepped onto the shoulder. The evening air was cooler now, carrying the smell of asphalt and exhaust as cars moved past in a steady stream. Whitmore directed him toward the rear of the SUV, then began asking the same questions in different forms. Where had he been? Who had he met? Why was he traveling alone? Why did he have a government-style briefcase in the back seat? Marcus answered only what was necessary. Each question pushed farther away from any ordinary traffic violation. Officer, what exactly are you investigating? Marcus asked. Whitmore ignored the question. You seem nervous. Marcus almost smiled at that. I am standing on the side of a highway while you ask me questions that have nothing to do with driving. Whitmore studied him, clearly irritated by the calmness. People who cooperate usually make things easier on themselves. Marcus looked toward the body camera on Whitmore's uniform. I am cooperating. That answer seemed to bother Whitmore more than an argument would have. He walked around the SUV, shining his flashlight through the windows. You carrying anything illegal? No. Anything I should know about? No. Then you will not mind if I take a look. Marcus's voice remained measured. I do not consent to a search. The highway seemed louder for a second. Whitmore turned toward him. You trying to tell me how to do my job? No, officer. I am telling you my answer. The distinction was simple, but it changed the atmosphere. Marcus had spent years watching interviews, surveillance operations, and interrogations. He knew how people behaved when they expected fear and received composure instead. They often pushed harder. Whitmore did exactly that. He asked who owned the vehicle again, even though the registration had already answered the question. He asked whether Marcus had borrowed it from someone. Then he asked whether Marcus could prove where he worked. Marcus looked at him for a long second. This was the moment he had hoped would never be necessary. Slowly, he reached toward his jacket. I am going to retrieve my identification, he said clearly. Whitmore watched every movement. Marcus removed a leather credential case and handed it over. Whitmore opened it beneath the flashlight. His eyes moved across the seal, the photograph, the name. Marcus Reed, Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a normal officer, that should have ended the uncertainty. Whitmore stared at it, then looked back at Marcus as though the information offended him. Where did you get this? Marcus's expression did not change. It was issued to me. Whitmore gave a short, humorless laugh. You expect me to believe this is real? Behind him, another patrol cruiser was approaching, its lights reflecting off the pavement as it pulled onto the shoulder. Marcus watched it stop several yards away. A younger officer stepped out and began walking toward them. Whitmore still held the credential in his hand. Marcus glanced at the approaching officer, then back at Whitmore. You can verify it. Whitmore folded the credential case, halfway closed. I will decide what gets verified. The younger officer came closer, looked at Marcus, then at the federal seal in Whitmore's hand. His expression changed almost immediately. Daniel, he said quietly, maybe we should call this in. Whitmore did not look at him. I have it under control. Marcus heard the words and understood the problem more clearly than before. Whitmore was no longer trying to determine the truth. He was trying to protect the conclusion he had already reached. And inside Marcus's SUV, unseen beneath the closed center console, the secure phone had already registered that he had missed a scheduled check-in. The younger officer stopped a few feet away, close enough now to see the credential clearly. And for the first time that evening, Marcus noticed uncertainty enter the scene from someone other than himself. Daniel, the officer said again, keeping his voice low. That looks legitimate. Whitmore finally turned toward him. I said I have it under control. The younger officer, whose nameplate read Aaron Blake, did not argue, but his eyes shifted back to Marcus with a different kind of attention. Not fear. Recognition. Marcus had seen that look before in field offices, courthouses, and secure facilities across the country. It was the moment someone realized the situation in front of them might be larger than it first appeared. Whitmore, however, seemed determined to make the moment smaller. He held the credential between two fingers as though it were something suspicious instead of official identification. Federal Bureau of Investigation, he read aloud, almost mockingly. Special Agent Marcus Reed. Marcus stood beside the SUV, shoulders relaxed, voice even. That is correct. Whitmore looked him up and down. And you expect me to believe you just happened to be a federal agent driving through my jurisdiction? Marcus let the question hang for a second. Federal agents drive on public highways too. Aaron Blake looked down briefly, perhaps hiding a reaction. Whitmore did not appreciate the answer. What was the meeting in Richmond about? That is not information I am going to discuss on the side of the road. So now you are refusing to cooperate. Marcus shook his head once. No. I am declining to discuss protected work information during a traffic stop. The distinction was precise, and Whitmore knew it. That seemed to frustrate him even more. Imagine standing there while someone asks you to prove facts that have already been proven, while every answer you give becomes the reason for another question. Marcus understood the pattern. He had interviewed suspects who lied because they were afraid, witnesses who hesitated because they were overwhelmed, and agents who became defensive when they felt their authority challenged. The more personal the pressure became, the more important discipline became. So Marcus did what years of training had taught him to do. He slowed everything down. He listened carefully. He answered clearly. He did not match Whitmore's tone. And most importantly, he watched. He watched where Whitmore placed the credential. He watched Aaron Blake glance toward the body camera on Whitmore's chest. He watched the patrol cruiser's dashboard camera pointed toward the shoulder. Every device was capturing the same thing from a different angle. Whitmore thought he was building a case around Marcus. Marcus was quietly recognizing that Whitmore was building a record around himself. "Run the badge number," Aaron said. Whitmore gave him a sharp look. "Why are you so eager to take his side?" Aaron's expression changed. "I am not taking anyone's side. I am saying we can verify it." Marcus heard the difference immediately. Aaron was not protecting him. He was protecting procedure. That mattered. Whitmore turned back to Marcus. "Stay right here." He walked toward his cruiser with the credential still in hand. Aaron remained nearby, silent for several seconds before speaking. "Sir, do you have someone expecting you?" Marcus looked toward his SUV. "Yes." "A supervisor?" "Among others." Aaron nodded slowly. What neither officer knew was that the missed check-in had already triggered a routine internal alert. In a secure office miles away, Marcus Reed's name had appeared on a screen with a timestamp beside it. A colleague had called once. Then again. No answer. The vehicle location had not moved. That alone did not mean danger, but it did mean someone would notice. And once someone noticed, the questions would begin moving in the opposite direction. Whitmore sat inside his cruiser with Marcus's credential resting on the center console beside him, but he still had not entered the verification number Aaron had suggested. Instead, he stared through the windshield at Marcus as though the answer he wanted might somehow appear if he waited long enough. Marcus stood near the rear quarter panel of the SUV, the highway wind pulling lightly at his jacket while headlights streamed past in long white lines. Aaron remained a few feet away, hands relaxed at his sides, watching both men with growing concern. "How long does verification usually take?" Marcus asked. Aaron glanced toward Whitmore's cruiser. "Not long." Marcus nodded. "Then why has he not done it?" Aaron did not answer. He did not need to. The silence said enough. Whitmore finally stepped out of the cruiser and walked back toward them, credential still in his hand. "I have another question," he said. Marcus looked at him. "Go ahead." Whitmore pointed toward the SUV. "You said you were coming from a work meeting. What is in the briefcase?" Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, not from fear, but from calculation. "Work materials." "What kind?" "Materials I am not authorized to discuss with you." Whitmore gave a small laugh. "Convenient." Marcus stayed calm. "You have my identification. You have my registration. You have my license. You can verify my employment. What traffic violation are you investigating?" Whitmore paused. "I observed behavior that raised suspicion." "What behavior?" Another pause. "You were driving slowly." Marcus looked toward the posted speed limit sign farther down the road. "I was driving 58 miles per hour in a 60-mile-per-hour zone." Aaron shifted his weight. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "You were watching me in your mirror." "Because a police cruiser was following me for 2 miles. The answer landed cleanly. No anger. No insult. Just fact. Whitmore changed direction again. "You have an expensive vehicle. You have restricted-looking equipment. You refuse to explain where you were. You can understand why that looks unusual." Marcus held his gaze. Unusual to whom? The question was quiet, but it changed the air. Aaron looked down for a moment. Whitmore's expression hardened. "Do not turn this into something it is not." Marcus answered immediately. "I have not called it anything. I am asking you to explain your reasoning." For the first time, Whitmore seemed unable to find a quick response. Traffic rushed past them. The patrol lights continued flashing. The body cameras continued recording. Marcus could hear every second becoming part of a permanent record. Then Whitmore gestured toward the SUV. "I want to look inside." Marcus shook his head once. "I do not consent to a search. If you have nothing to hide, why make this difficult?" Marcus looked directly at him. Exercising a right is not making something difficult. Aaron turned toward Whitmore. "Daniel, we should verify the credential and finish the stop." Whitmore ignored him. "Maybe I need to bring in a supervisor." Marcus's expression remained steady. "That would be appropriate." The answer seemed to surprise both officers. Whitmore had expected resistance. Instead, Marcus welcomed more witnesses, more procedure, more accountability. That was the part Whitmore still did not understand. Marcus was not afraid of scrutiny. He had spent most of his career working inside systems where every report, interview, and decision could be reviewed line by line. What concerned him was the opposite: authority operating without review. Whitmore turned away and reached for his radio. At almost the same moment, inside Marcus's SUV, the secure phone vibrated again. Miles away, the missed check-in had now moved beyond a routine reminder. A duty officer had opened Marcus's schedule, confirmed the Richmond meeting, checked the vehicle location, and placed a second call. When that call also went unanswered, the matter was forwarded upward. Not as an emergency, not yet, but as something that required an explanation. On the highway shoulder, Whitmore lifted his radio and requested a supervisor. He believed he was tightening control over the situation. He had no idea that somewhere outside his jurisdiction, people were already beginning to ask why Special Agent Marcus Reed had stopped moving and why he was not answering his secure phone. Whitmore finished the radio call and clipped the microphone back onto his shoulder, visibly more confident now that a supervisor was on the way. Marcus remained beside the SUV, listening to the traffic move past and watching the situation become more complicated for reasons that had nothing to do with him. Aaron stood nearby, quieter than before. He had seen enough traffic stops to recognize when an officer was following procedure and when an officer was searching for a reason to justify what had already happened. "You still have not verified the credential," Aaron said. Whitmore looked at him. "I told you I am handling it." "Then handle it." The words were respectful, but firmer this time. Whitmore stared at him for a moment, then pulled out his phone and entered the number printed on the federal identification. Marcus said nothing. This was the simplest part of the entire stop. One call, one confirmation, one fact that should have been checked minutes earlier. Whitmore waited as the line connected. "This is Officer Daniel Whitmore with the Virginia State Police. I need to verify federal credentials." He gave Marcus's full name, identification number, and date of birth. Then he listened. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. The confidence in his face weakened first. Then the irritation disappeared. "Yes," he said. A pause. "I understand." Another pause. "Special Agent?" Aaron looked toward Marcus. Marcus did not react. Whitmore turned slightly away, lowering his voice as though speaking quietly might change what he had just heard. "Yes, I have him here now." The voice on the other end asked something else. Whitmore glanced toward the SUV. "Traffic stop." Another pause. "No, he is not under arrest." Marcus watched closely. That sentence mattered. Less than 2 minutes earlier, Whitmore had spoken as though Marcus might be involved in something serious. Now, suddenly, he was carefully defining the limits of the encounter. "What did they say?" Aaron asked when Whitmore ended the call. Whitmore slipped the phone into his pocket. "His credentials check out." Aaron exhaled slowly. "Then we should give them back and finish this." Whitmore did not move. Marcus watched him study the federal identification again, but the problem was no longer whether it was real. The problem was that accepting it forced Whitmore to reconsider every assumption he had made before seeing it. "Officer," Marcus said, "may I have my credential back?" Whitmore looked at him. "I still have questions." Aaron's head turned sharply. Marcus stayed calm. "About what?" "About why a federal agent is traveling through here with restricted materials." Marcus answered evenly. "That is not part of your traffic stop." "Maybe it should be." Marcus studied him for a moment. "You verified who I am. You verified the vehicle belongs to me. You have not identified a traffic violation. What exactly are you trying to establish now?" Whitmore looked toward the approaching headlights in the distance. Another patrol vehicle was coming down the shoulder. "My supervisor can decide that." Marcus nodded once. "Fine." There was no frustration in his voice. That unsettled Whitmore more than anger would have. Marcus knew something he did not. Every additional minute created more documentation, more witnesses, and more questions that someone would eventually have to answer. Aaron stepped closer to Whitmore and lowered his voice. "Daniel, this is getting harder to explain." Whitmore responded without looking at him. "Then do not explain it." Aaron glanced at Marcus, then at the body camera on Whitmore's chest. "It is already explaining itself." For the first time, Whitmore had no reply. The new patrol vehicle pulled in behind them, and a supervisor stepped out. At the same moment, inside a secure federal operations center, Marcus's missed check-in had been escalated again. His location was confirmed. His credential verification had been logged. Someone noticed that a Virginia officer had just called about him. Those details reached a desk farther up the chain, where a simple question was asked. Why was a verified federal agent still being held on the side of the road? The supervisor who stepped from the 3rd patrol vehicle was Captain Thomas Hale, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s whose expression changed the moment Aaron quietly handed him the facts. Hale listened without interrupting. Marcus Reed, verified Federal Bureau of Investigation credentials. No confirmed traffic violation. No arrest. No contraband. No consent to search. A stop that had stretched well beyond the point where any ordinary explanation should have ended. Hale looked at Whitmore. You verified him? Yes, Captain. And his vehicle? Registered to him. And what was the original reason for the stop? Whitmore hesitated. Driving behavior. Hale's eyes narrowed. What behavior? Whitmore glanced toward Marcus, then back at Hale. He was moving below the speed limit and monitoring me in his mirror. Aaron shifted slightly. Hale did not. You stopped a driver for going 2 miles per hour under the speed limit and looking in his rearview mirror? Whitmore's face tightened. There were other indicators. Name them. The silence that followed felt different from every silence before it. This one did not belong to Whitmore. Hale had taken control simply by asking for facts. Marcus watched from beside the SUV, saying nothing. He had learned long ago that weak reasoning often collapsed when someone finally required it to stand on its own. Whitmore tried again. The vehicle, the briefcase, his refusal to answer certain questions. Hale looked toward Marcus. Did he refuse identification? No. Registration? No. Did he threaten anyone? No. Did he interfere with the stop? Whitmore paused. Not exactly. Hale's jaw tightened. Then what are we still doing here? Whitmore looked frustrated now, but the confidence was gone. Captain, I thought the federal badge might be fake. And then you verified it. Yes. So why is he still standing on the shoulder? Whitmore had no clean answer. Marcus could see Aaron watching the exchange with the focused stillness of someone who knew every word mattered. Hale turned toward Marcus. Special Agent Reed, I apologize for the delay. Give me 1 minute to sort this out. Marcus nodded. Take the time you need. Hale stepped aside and reached for his radio. That was when the next change came. Not from the highway. Not from another cruiser. From dispatch. The voice over Hale's radio asked him to move to a private channel immediately. Hale frowned and complied. Captain Hale. The response on the other end was brief, formal, and unlike a routine local transmission. Hale listened. His eyes shifted toward Marcus. Understood. Another pause. Yes, I will preserve everything. Whitmore looked at him. Aaron looked at him. Marcus did not move. Hale ended the transmission and lowered the radio slowly. What is it? Whitmore asked. Hale stared at him for a moment before answering. The Federal Bureau of Investigation Field Office has contacted State Command. Whitmore's face lost color. Hale continued. They are asking for confirmation that Agent Reed is safe, and they want all body camera and dashboard camera footage from this stop preserved. Aaron looked toward Marcus. Whitmore said nothing. Hale was not finished. They also want the names and badge numbers of every officer present. The highway noise seemed to fade beneath the weight of the words. Whitmore looked at Marcus as if seeing him clearly for the first time. But Marcus's expression had not changed. He was not smiling. He was not celebrating. He simply stood there, calm and observant, because he understood something Whitmore was only beginning to realize. The verification call had not ended the situation. It had opened a door. Somewhere beyond Virginia, people had connected the missed check-in, the credential inquiry, and the unexplained delay. The stop was no longer being viewed as a question about Marcus Reed. It was becoming a question about the officer who had decided Marcus needed to prove more than everyone else. Captain Hale looked from Whitmore to Marcus, then back toward the line of patrol vehicles glowing against the darkening Virginia sky. The atmosphere had changed completely, but Marcus knew better than to mistake that change for justice. It was only attention, and attention, unlike justice, could disappear the moment the cameras stopped rolling. Hale handed Marcus his federal credential personally. Special Agent Reed, your identification. Marcus accepted it and slipped it back into his jacket. Thank you. Whitmore stood several feet away, no longer directing the scene, no longer asking questions, no longer pretending the stop was moving according to his plan. Aaron remained beside Hale, watching quietly. Then the radio came alive again. Dispatch requested hail on the secure channel. This time, everyone noticed the change in his posture before he even answered. Captain Hale speaking. He listened for several seconds. Yes, sir. Another pause. Understood. Whitmore looked toward him. Marcus watched without expression. Hale continued listening, then said, We will preserve the original files and restrict access until State Command provides instructions. When he ended the call, Aaron asked the question Whitmore seemed afraid to ask. What happened? Hale looked toward Marcus first. The request has moved beyond the field office. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. Who contacted State Command? Hale took a breath. Federal headquarters. Silence settled over the shoulder of the highway. Whitmore stared at Hale. Washington. Hale nodded once. They want a complete record of the stop. Every camera file. Every radio transmission. Dispatch logs. The credential verification call. Everything. Whitmore tried to recover some certainty. Captain, this was a routine stop that got complicated. Hale turned toward him. Then the record should make that clear. That answer left Whitmore nowhere to go. Facts did not argue. Cameras did not care about rank. Timestamps did not change because someone felt misunderstood. Marcus looked toward the body camera on Whitmore's uniform and thought about how easily this night could have ended differently if he had been someone else. No federal identification. No missed secure check-in. No colleague noticing that his vehicle had stopped moving. No call climbing through the chain until someone hundreds of miles away asked why a verified federal agent was still being held beside a highway. Aaron broke the silence. Captain, should Agent Reed be free to leave? Hale looked almost embarrassed that the question still needed to be asked. Yes. Immediately. Marcus did not move. Before I leave, I want the reason for the original stop documented. Whitmore looked at him. You are free to go. I heard Captain Hale. Marcus's voice remained calm. I am asking what reason will appear in the report. Whitmore's face tightened. Suspicious driving behavior. Marcus looked at Hale. 58 miles per hour in a 60 mile per hour zone. Hale said nothing. Marcus continued. Looking in my rearview mirror while a patrol vehicle followed me. Again, silence. He was not raising his voice. He did not need to. The details sounded different now that someone had to say them plainly. Whitmore finally spoke. There were circumstances that made me believe further investigation was necessary. Marcus held his gaze. What circumstances? Whitmore looked toward the SUV, then toward Aaron, then down at the pavement. There was no answer that did not expose the weakness of the assumptions behind the stop. Hale stepped in. That question will be addressed in the review. Marcus nodded slowly. Good. His secure phone began vibrating inside the SUV again. This time Marcus walked to the driver's door, reached inside, and retrieved it. The screen showed multiple missed calls from the field office and one new incoming call from a number he recognized. Immediately, he answered. Reed. A familiar voice asked one question. Are you safe? Marcus looked across the roof of his SUV at Whitmore, Hale, and Aaron standing beneath the flashing lights. Yes, he said. Then he paused. But I think you need to see the footage. Marcus ended the call, slipped the secure phone into his jacket, and looked once more at the highway shoulder before getting back into the SUV. Captain Hale stood near Whitmore's cruiser, already giving instructions about preserving the footage. Aaron remained quiet, but his attention had shifted entirely. The stop was over. The questions were not. Marcus drove away several minutes later, merging back into traffic beneath a sky that had turned almost completely dark. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something heavier. He kept thinking about the moment Whitmore had looked at his registration, his license, his federal credential, and still searched for another reason not to believe him. Marcus had spent enough years investigating patterns to know that one incident rarely existed alone. People repeated what they believed they could get away with. By the time he reached the field office, the first preservation requests had already gone out. The footage was secured before anyone could overwrite it. Dispatch logs were copied. Radio traffic was archived. The credential verification call was retained. Every timestamp became part of the record. Marcus sat in a quiet conference room while two supervisors reviewed the opening minutes of the stop. Nobody spoke at first. They watched Whitmore follow the SUV for 2 miles. They listened to the questions. They heard Marcus ask for the reason for the stop. They watched the explanation shift. Slow driving. Looking in the mirror. An expensive vehicle. A briefcase. Protected work information. Then came the credential, the pause, the refusal to accept what was directly in front of him. One supervisor leaned back slowly. Has this officer been complained about before? That single question changed everything. A request went to Virginia State Command. At first, the answer seemed ordinary. Yes, Whitmore had prior complaints. Most had been closed without formal discipline. But when investigators began reading them instead of counting them, the similarities became difficult to ignore. Drivers described being questioned about whether they owned their vehicles. Several said routine stops had expanded into unrelated inquiries. Others reported being asked why they were traveling through certain neighborhoods or where they worked, even when those questions had nothing to do with the stated reason for the stop. Marcus stared at the summaries as they appeared on the screen. Different dates, different roads, different people, similar language, similar assumptions, similar outcomes. One complaint had been dismissed because there was no clear recording, another because the driver had been alone, a third because the officer's written report had been treated as more reliable than the driver's account. Marcus felt no satisfaction reading any of it. The opposite. Every closed complaint represented someone who had walked away wondering whether anyone had believed them. By midnight, the review had expanded beyond the traffic stop. Internal Affairs requested additional footage from Whitmore's previous encounters. State Command ordered the original files locked against deletion or alteration. Federal officials asked for copies of the relevant records. Aaron Blake was contacted for a formal statement. His answer was simple. Marcus had cooperated. His documents were valid. The credential had been verifiable within minutes. There had been no clear reason to keep extending the stop. The next morning, Marcus returned to the conference room and found a growing timeline spread across the table. He looked at it for a long time before speaking. This cannot become a story about an agent getting special attention because of who he works for. One of the supervisors nodded. Marcus continued. If the only reason anyone cares is because I had a federal badge, then we have missed the point. The room fell silent. He looked at the names attached to the earlier complaints. Ordinary people. No federal titles. No secure phones. No office in Washington asking why they had stopped moving. That was when Marcus understood what the real investigation had become. It was no longer about proving what happened to him. The cameras had already done that. It was about finding out how many people had told the truth before him and had simply never had enough power behind their names to make someone listen. 3 weeks later, Marcus Reed sat beneath the bright lights of a state review room while the final findings were read aloud. There were no flashing patrol lights now, no passing traffic, no shoulder of a highway stretching into darkness. Just a long wooden table, a row of officials, several thick folders, and Officer Daniel Whitmore sitting across from the man he had once treated as if his identity were something to be doubted. The investigation had moved faster than anyone expected because the evidence had been unusually complete. Body camera footage matched the dashboard recording. Dispatch logs matched the timestamps. Aaron Blake's statement matched Marcus's account. And when investigators compared that traffic stop with earlier complaints, the similarities became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Whitmore had repeatedly expanded routine stops after drivers had already provided valid documents. He had questioned ownership of vehicles without clear cause. He had treated ordinary explanations as suspicious when they came from people he had already decided not to trust. None of those earlier incidents had carried Marcus's federal credentials or Washington's immediate attention, but together they created a pattern. Whitmore was removed from active roadside duty while disciplinary proceedings moved forward, and several previously closed complaints were reopened for independent review. Marcus listened without satisfaction. This was accountability, but it could not give those drivers back the hours they had spent wondering whether anyone would believe them. When the chair of the review panel asked whether Marcus wanted to make a final statement, he looked across the table at Whitmore. The officer seemed smaller now, not because anyone had humiliated him, but because the uniform could no longer answer the questions for him. Marcus spoke calmly. I want to ask you something. Whitmore lifted his eyes. Marcus continued. What if I had been nobody? The room became completely still. What if I had not been a federal agent? What if there had been no secure phone, no missed check-in, no field office looking for me, no call from Washington? What if I had simply been a black man driving home from work? Whitmore opened his mouth, but no answer came. Marcus did not press him. The silence was the answer. He looked toward the officials at the table. The important part of this case is not that the system eventually worked for me. The important part is asking why it took my position to make people look closely. Aaron, seated near the wall as a witness, lowered his eyes. Captain Hale remained motionless. Marcus continued, "A person's rights should not become more valuable because someone important knows their name." Months later, reforms followed the review. Supervisors were required to document extended roadside detentions more clearly. Complaint patterns were flagged for earlier examination. Officers received renewed training on lawful questioning, professional conduct, and the difference between reasonable suspicion and assumption. None of it was dramatic. That was exactly the point. Real accountability rarely arrived with applause. It arrived through records, procedures, witnesses, and people willing to ask why. Marcus returned to work. He never considered himself the hero of what happened. On some nights, driving home along the same Virginia highway, he still remembered Whitmore holding his credential under a flashlight and refusing to believe what was directly in front of him. But another thought stayed with him longer. The traffic stop had lasted less than an hour. The truth it uncovered had been waiting for years. Whitmore had believed the badge on his chest gave him power over the man standing beside that road. In the end, the cameras, the records, and the truth turned that same authority into evidence. And Marcus knew the measure of justice was never whether it protected a man with a federal badge. It was whether it protected the person who had nothing but his word.